Slide 1, Heroes of the Holocaust, title page. A booklet published in Jerusalem in 1940 by the United Aid Committee for the Jews in Poland used the word Shoah, a Hebrew word for mass slaughter, to describe the extermination of Europe's Jewish population. In the 1950s, the word Holocaust had become part of the human lexicon to describe the calculated, systematic, and industrialized genocide that befell the Jews and other targeted ethnic groups during the time much of Europe fell under the Nazi shadow. 2/3 of Europe's Jews and 1/3 of the world's Jewish population were annihilated. Other victims of the Nazi scourge were the Sinti and Roma, Polish citizens, Soviet prisoners of war, homosexuals, the mentally and physically challenged, Freemasons, Jehovah's Witnesses, and political and religious dissidents. According to Michael Berenbaum, project director for the creation of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and the first director of the United States Holocaust Research Institute, the Holocaust began slowly. Age-old prejudice led to discrimination, discrimination to persecution, persecution to incarceration, incarceration to annihilation, and mass murder, which culminated with the killing of 6 million Jews, did not begin with the Jews, nor did it encompass only the Jews. The violations of one group's rights are seldom contained only to that group. Germany set off World War II to fulfill Hitler's expansionist plans. As the Nazi war machine swept across Europe, persecution of the Jews intensified. Then on January 20th, 1942, a conference was held in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee. The 87-minute conference was attended by Reinhard Heydrich, Adolf Eichmann, and 13 other Nazi leaders to discuss the elimination of Europe's Jews, a genocidal plan that was labeled the final solution. And yet, among this dark and hopeless period of human history, a time in which a society was gripped by incomprehensible depths of depravity and barbarism, there were those few individuals, those lights amid this horrifying insanity, who risked everything, even their own lives, to save Jewish lives. Slide 2, Yad Vashem, Righteous Among the Nations. Since 1953, Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust Memorial, has recognized over 26,000 people as righteous among the nations, those who made an effort to assist victims, mostly Jews, who were persecuted and annihilated by Nazi Germany and its fascist allies during the Holocaust. Slide 3, Names and Numbers of the Righteous Among the Nations. This presentation is a homage to those individuals, known and unknown, who, amid the darkness, moral depravity, and death that surrounded them, reached out to save the lives of others in acts of incredible compassion, strength of character, and humanity that is humbling to many of us who will probably never experience the world they survived. Whether it was an act of kindness, a verbal defense of the persecuted, surreptitiously providing food or other supplies, offering financial support, providing legal defense, opening one's home or institution as a refuge, or forging documents to give one a chance to survive, those brave souls, too numerous to recount in this presentation, deserve the world's utmost respect. The musical selections performed in this presentation were written by individuals who experienced this period in human history and were affected in some way by the events that were unfolding. Slide 4, Pavel Haas. Czech composer Pavel Haas studied composition with the influential Leos Janáček, becoming one of Janáček's most significant protégés. Haas's work thus bears the influence of Janáček, as well as folk music and jazz, and occasionally Hebrew melody. Haas composed more than 50 works, of which he gave opus numbers to only 18 of them. He wrote symphonies, choral works, lieder, chamber music, and scores for cinema and theater. Haas's opera, The Charlatan of 1938, earned him the Smetana Foundation Award, which he shared with Vyacheslava Kapralova, who received the award for her military sinfonietta. As conditions worsened for Jews under Nazi rule, Haas attempted to emigrate to the United States. In 1938, he wrote to relatives of his wife, Sonia Jacobson, in New Jersey, and to Frank Rybka in New York, who was a former student of Janáček. They attempted to secure passage for Haas and his family, but it was too late. Prior to his arrest, Haas officially divorced his wife so that she and their daughter, Olga, would not experience a similar fate. In 1941, Haas was deported to the Theresienstadt concentration camp, also known as Theresienstadt, the model concentration camp used for propaganda purposes to deceive the world's scrutiny. There he joined other Moravian Jewish composers, such as Victor Ullmann, Gideon Klein, and Hans Krasse. Klein encouraged the depressed Pavel Haas to compose when he arrived at the camp. Haas wrote at least 8 works while incarcerated, including Study for String Orchestra, which Czech conductor Karel Anserl premiered in Theresienstadt and remains Haas's best-known work. In 1944, the Nazis remodeled Theresienstadt before the Red Cross arrived for a visit. A propaganda film was made by director Kurt Geron titled The Fuhrer Gives the Jews a City. In the film, children are seen singing Hans Krasse's opera Brundibar, conducted by Anserl. Once the propaganda project was finished, the Nazis transferred 18,000 prisoners, including Haas and the children who had performed in Brundibar, to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where they were murdered in the gas chambers. Anserl informed Haas's brother Hugo of the circumstances of Pavel's death. Anserl and Pavel Haas stood together after their arrival at Auschwitz to be inspected by the camp personnel. Dr. Josef Mengele was about to send Anserl to the gas chamber first, but when the weakened Haas began to cough, he was sent to his death instead. Musical selection: Pavel Haas, Suite for Piano. Slide 5, Kristallnacht. Beginning in 1933, Nazi rule imposed harsher conditions on the Jewish population of Germany, and many Jews sought to leave their native country, realizing it was the only way to escape Nazism and native anti-Semitism. Many governments opened their doors to Jewish refugees. On November 9, 1938, the Nazi regime openly initiated full-blown persecution of its Jewish citizens with Kristallnacht, which resulted in over 1,000 synagogues damaged or destroyed, thousands of Jewish businesses damaged, 30,000 Jews arrested, and at least 91 Jews murdered. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, which at the time had the largest Jewish community in the world, setting off World War II. The German invasion of France from May to June of 1940 set off the largest single movement of refugees in European history. An estimated 8 to 10 million people from northern France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and the Netherlands frantically took to the roads and railways to escape the Nazi invasion, an event dubbed the Exodus. Slide 6, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. The United States accepted the largest number of Jewish refugees, more than 150,000, and was followed by Great Britain with more than 80,000, including almost 10,000 children brought to Britain in an endeavor known as the Kindertransport. In fact, the Jewish refugee crisis became such a concern that in July of 1938, United States President Franklin Delano Roosevelt called a conference in France called the Avian Conference to address the refugee crisis. Representatives from 32 countries attended the conclave, including those representing the United States, Great Britain, and France. Even though most countries expressed sympathy for the plight of the refugees, they refused to ease immigration restrictions or offer worthwhile assistance to the refugees. The only country willing to accept Jews was the Dominican Republic, which was willing to take in up to 150,000 refugees. Despite this reluctance, individual diplomats made extraordinary efforts to issue as many visas as possible to assist people in their desperate attempts to flee persecution. Slide 7, Kindertransport. The Kindertransport was an organized rescue effort to rescue as many children from Nazi Germany during the 9 months prior to the outbreak of World War II, from December 1938 to September 1939. The United Kingdom took in about 10,000 children, mostly Jewish, from Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Danzig. The children were placed in foster homes, hostels, schools, and farms. Many of these children never saw their families again. The rescue of so many children was a collaborative effort undertaken by the British government and Jewish and Quaker welfare organizations. Slide 7, Father Bruno. According to Holocaust scholar Lawrence Langer, Nazi power repeatedly forced people to make choiceless choices. Such choices, he states, do not reflect options between life and death, but between one form of abnormal response and another, both imposed by a situation that was in no way of a victim's choosing. Perry London was one of the first scholars to study the background and motivations of non-Jewish rescuers during the Holocaust. Rescuers were often driven by religious beliefs or the belief that it was one's duty to help another. Other reasons included a dislike of Nazism and its abhorrent racial doctrines, resistance to a force that bullied individuals into acting against their conscience, or quite simply the resistance to allow evil to triumph over decency in society. Entire nations and communities united to prevent the deportation and annihilation of Jewish citizens. In reflecting on the reasons why so many Bulgarian Jews survived the Holocaust, historian Svetlana Todorov remarked that the people were opposed to the anti-Semitic measures, but a community is powerless without leaders, without those individuals within its midst who exercise public responsibility. In this case, the metropolitans, the deputies, the politicians who were ready to accept the risks that their actions entailed. All this was necessary for good to triumph in a certain place and at a certain time. Any break in the chain and their efforts might well have failed. It seems that, once introduced into public life, evil easily perpetuates itself, whereas good is always difficult, rare, and fragile, and yet possible. Slide 9, Irina Sendler. Religious denominations that sheltered Jews included Roman Catholics, Franciscans, the Benedictines, and Jesuits, Greek and Russian Orthodox Christians, and Protestants, both Baptists and Lutherans. The pulpits of Protestant churches had become effective methods of anti-Nazi communication during this time. Both Christian and Muslim Albanians provided refuge to Jews and refused to hand over its small Jewish population to the Germans. The moral code of Besa, word of honor, is built into the Albanian culture, in which one retains integrity and helps others in a time of need, even sublimating one's own needs. As a result, at the end of World War II, Albania was the only European country whose Jewish population increased over the course of the war. Slide 10, Vítislava Kapralova. Czech composer and conductor Vítislava Kapralova was the daughter of composer Václav Kapral and singer Victoria Olarova. Kapralova started composing at the age of 9, and at the age of 15 she entered Brno Conservatory, where she studied composition and conducting, continuing her composition studies privately with Bohuslav Martinu and conducting with Charles Munch in Paris. In 1937, she conducted the Czech Philharmonic, and a year later she conducted the BBC Orchestra in her composition Military Sinfonietta to critical acclaim. Kapralova died in Montpellier, France, at the age of 25, possibly from typhoid fever. She left behind an impressive body of works, much of which was published in her lifetime. Among those who admired her work was Raphael Kubelik, who premiered Waving Farewell, a work for voice and orchestra, as well as her other orchestral works. Kapralova composed her most well-known piano work, April Preludes, for Rudolf Verkusny. In 1946, the Czech Academy of Sciences and the Arts honored Kapralova membership in the institution in memoriam. By 1948, only 10 women out of 648 members were given this honor. Kapralova's oeuvre includes her renowned art songs, music for piano, a string quartet, a woodwind trio, music for cello and piano, and violin and piano, an orchestral cantata, 2 piano concertos, 2 orchestral suites, a sinfonietta, and a concertino for clarinet, violin, and orchestra. Musical selection, Elegy for violin and piano, Kapralova. Slide 11, secret annex in the Anne Frank house. Aiding a Jewish person carried enormous risk. Lighter penalties included economic hardship or incarceration in a concentration camp, whereas in Poland and Eastern Europe, the penalty for helping a Jew was death. Families of rescuers were often punished as well as entire villages. Hostile and unscrupulous neighbors who hoped to profit from obtaining Jewish property could be as dangerous as the Gestapo, often betraying both the refugee and the one hiding him. Two basic conditions determine the safety of finding a haven for Jews: the attitude of local inhabitants and the punishment that awaited those who extended help. Jews were hidden in barns, haystacks, sheds, haylofts, attics, spaces beneath sheds and houses, and underground cellars. This slide shows the secret annex in the house in Amsterdam, where Anne Frank's family hid for nearly 2 years before their hiding place was revealed to the Nazis. Many of the Jews who survived Nazi rule between 1939 and 1945 owed their survival to the efforts of non-Jewish people. 6 million Jews lost their lives during the Holocaust, but tens of thousands were saved. Slide 12, 3 Jewish sisters hiding in a forest in Poland. Some Jews fled to forests in rural areas, building shelters or hiding in caves and other natural formations. Some dug underground tunnels or hid in existing tunnels. In some cities, such as Lvov, Ukraine, Jews found refuge in city sewers. Slide 13, Sofia, Zukka. The countries of Norway, Finland, and Denmark were remarkable for resisting Nazi initiatives to deport the Jews of their countries to concentration camps, a concerted effort that involved government officials, church leaders, citizens, and resistance movements saved the lives of thousands of Jews who either were never deported or were secretly transported into neighboring countries. Slide 14, Hugh O'Flaherty and Delia Kiernan. Although the Italian fascist regime had implemented anti-Semitic measures that restricted Jewish participation in certain professions, Italy did not cooperate with Nazi Germany in segregating and deporting Jews to concentration camps. In fact, the Italians labeled anti-Semitism the German disease. Pope Pius XII denounced the Nazi measures to exterminate the Jewish population in the Christmas message of 1942, which was broadcast over the Vatican radio. Humanity owes this vow to those hundreds of thousands who, without any fault on their part, sometimes only because of their nationality or race, have been consigned to death or to a slow decline. A great part of humanity have to some extent their share in the collective responsibility for the growth of error and for the harm and the lack of moral fiber in the society of today. Slide 15, Mary Elms and John Zwartendijk. After Mussolini's regime ended in July 1943, German armies entered Italy from the north, occupying areas as far south as Rome. SS agents arrived with the troops, determined to deport Jews in areas of Italy under German military rule to the death camps. In October, the SS undertook the deportation of the city's 5,730 Jews, a move that was prevented when the Vatican clergy opened the sanctuaries of Vatican City to all non-Aryans in need of refuge. These efforts were aided by embassies in Rome, Italian citizens, and the numerous monasteries and convents in the city. Less than 1/5 of Rome's Jewish population was seized. Slide 16, Varian Fry. Within Germany itself was resistance to Nazi initiatives to implement racial doctrines that would eliminate the Jewish race. On February 27, 1943, the Gestapo in Berlin rounded up 4,700 Jewish men married to non-Jewish women and took them to a detention center in the Rosenstrasse. From there, they were to be deported to their deaths. An estimated 2,000 of their wives gathered to demonstrate and demand their release, followed by about 2,000 more. The women stayed in the streets for an entire week, refusing to leave until their husbands were freed. On March 6, Joseph Goebbels gave in, and the men who were to be deported were labeled privileged persons to be incorporated in the national community. As a result of this remarkable act of collective courage, all of the Jewish husbands survived the war. Slide 17, Mario Castelnuovo Tedesco. Mario Castelnuovo Tedesco was an Italian composer, pianist, and one of the most recognizable composers of the 20th century for the guitar. Later, he worked as a film composer in America and wrote concertos for legendary violinist Jascha Heifetz and cellist Gregor Piatigorsky. Castelnuovo Tedesco was born in Florence to an Italian Sephardic Jewish family. He was descended from a prominent banking family that had resided in Tuscany, specifically Siena, for more than 400 years, as his father's forebears had settled there as refugees following the expulsion of Jews from Spain in 1492. Castelnuovo Tedesco composed his first works at the age of 9. He received a degree in piano performance and then continued his studies in composition under the prominent Italian composer Ildebrando Bizzetti. Castelnuovo Tedesco soon gained a reputation as one of Italy's most promising young composers. His works were included in the first festival of the International Society of Contemporary Music, which was held in Salzburg, Austria, in 1922. At the 1932 festival held in Venice, Castelnuovo Tedesco met the Italian guitarist Andrea Segovia. This meeting inspired him to write for the guitar, ultimately composing almost 100 works for the instrument and earning him a place as one of the most important 20th century composers for the guitar. Mussolini's imposition of anti-Semitism in Italy, which he promoted to placate Hitler and draw the two countries together in a common political and ideological alliance, was mobilized using the press and radio broadcasts. Consequently, Castelnuovo Tedesco was banned from the radio and performances of his works were canceled. On July 14, 1938, Mussolini put forth the Manifesto of the Racial Scientist, which stated that Italian civilization is of Aryan origin and that Jews are not part of the pure Italian race. Between September and November of 1938, Italy enacted a series of racial laws that effectively barred foreign Jews from settling in Italy or its colonial possessions, banned Jews from jobs in government, banking, insurance, military, education, law, or the entertainment industry. Jews were banned from educational institutions, marriage was prohibited between Jews and non-Jews, and Italian citizenship granted to Jewish foreigners after January 1, 1919, was revoked, and they were required to leave after 6 months. These new racial laws convinced Castelnuovo Tedesco to leave Italy. He wrote to conductor Arturo Toscanini, former music director of La Scala, and violinist Jascha Heifetz, and both supported his efforts. With the aid of Jascha Heifetz, Castelnuovo Tedesco was able to leave Italy in 1939. He settled in Hollywood, as did many other artists fleeing fascism during this time. With Heifetz's aid, he was able to secure a contract as a film composer for Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, MGM. Over the next 15 years, he composed music for some 200 films for MGM and other studios. Castelnuovo Tedesco was an important influence on other film composers, including Henry Mancini, Nelson Riddle, Hermann Stein, and Andre Previn. Jerry Goldsmith, Marty Paich, and John Williams were all pupils of Castelnuovo Tedesco. Musical selection, Signorina, from Two Profiles for Violin and Piano by Mario Castelnuovo Tedesco. Slide 18, Dimitar Peshev. Slide 19, Pierre-Marie Benoit. Slide 20, Karl Lutz. Swiss diplomat Karl Lutz was the Swiss vice consul in Budapest, Hungary from 1942 until the end of World War II. Throughout 1942 and 1943, while Jews in other European countries were being ruthlessly segregated in ghettos and deported to death camps, the Jews of Hungary were left untouched by these events. But when the Nazis gained control of Budapest in 1944, Adolf Eichmann arrived in Budapest with a special SS commando to carry out deportations as quickly as possible. Working closely with Raoul Wallenberg, Lutz negotiated a deal with both the Hungarian government and the Nazis to issue protective letters to 8,000 Jewish families for emigration to Palestine. He also set up some 76 safe houses around Budapest, declaring them annexes of the Swiss legation and thus off limits to the violently anti-Semitic Hungarian Arrow Cross movement or Nazi forces. The well-known glass house was declared to be the Swiss Legation Representation of Foreign Interests, Department of Immigration. Several hundred Budapest Jews could register there as Swiss-protected individuals. Karl Lutz's issuance of letters is estimated to have saved over 62,000 Jewish lives. Slide 21, Victor Ullmann. Victor Ullmann was born to parents of Jewish descent who had converted to Catholicism before his birth. While serving in the military during World War I, he was granted study leave. He began studying law at Vienna University, after which he began composition studies with Arnold Schoenberg. He then moved to Prague, where he continued his studies with Alexander von Zemlinsky. He served as conductor of the Prague State Opera for 5 years. At the International Society for New Music, held in Geneva in 1929, his piano cycle, Schoenberg Variations, was performed to much acclaim. His orchestral arrangement of the work 5 years later earned him the Hertzke Prize. Ullmann worked in a number of different jobs over the next few years in Prague, including writing music and book reviews for magazines, music reviewer for the Bohemia newspaper. He gave private music lessons and was actively involved in the Czechoslovak Society for Music Education. Ullmann enrolled in composer Alois Haba's Department of Quarter-Tone Music at the Prague Conservatory. Ullmann developed his own harmonic system, which was derived from the harmonic series between the notes 8 to 14 of the natural harmonic series. On March 15, 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Czechoslovakia, and the persecution of Jews commenced. On September 8, 1942, Ullmann was deported to the Theresienstadt concentration camp, where he continued to compose, worked as a piano accompanist and music reviewer, and organized concerts called Collegium Musicum and the Studio for New Music. He was part of a circle of prominent musicians who were imprisoned in the camp. Rather than lament his fate, Ullmann wrote of his activities in the camp in a very hopeful manner. One has to stress, nevertheless, that Theresienstadt contributed to emphasize and did not hinder my musical activities, that in no way whatsoever we sat down to weep on the banks of the waters of Babylon, and that our effort to serve the arts respectfully was proportionate to our will to live in spite of everything. I am convinced that those who fight in life as well as in art to triumph over matter, which always resists, will share my point of view. On October 16, 1944, Victor Ullmann was deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where he was killed in the gas chambers 2 days later. Musical selection, Victor Ullmann, Piano Sonata, number 6. Slide 22, Ho Fengshan and Chion Sukahara. Diplomat Ho Fengshan was consul general in Vienna for the Republic of China during World War II. He disobeyed the orders of his superiors and issued thousands of transit visas to Shanghai, then under Japanese occupation, except for foreign concessions. Even though a visa was necessary to enter Shanghai, it was needed for Jews to leave Austria. Many Jewish families left for Shanghai and then on to Hong Kong and Australia. Ho signed the 1906th visa on October 27, 1938, and was recalled to China in May of 1940. Japanese diplomat Chion Tsujihara served as vice consul for the Japanese Empire in Kaunas, Lithuania. When the Soviet Union occupied Lithuania in 1940, many Polish and Lithuanian Jews sought exit visas to escape persecution. Even though the Soviet Union offered citizenship to those living in occupied Lithuania, many Jewish intellectuals and rabbis wished to leave. In July of 1940, Jewish refugees began arriving in Japan. Ignoring the orders from his superior over a technicality regarding visas, Tsujihara issued over 2,100 visas. He spoke to the Soviet officials who agreed to allow the Jews travel through the country via the Trans-Siberian Railway. Tsujihara wrote out visas until September 4, 1940, when he had to leave before the consulate was closed. Even when boarding the train to leave, he continued writing visas and throwing them into the anxious crowd. Slide 23, Shanghai Ghetto. The Shanghai Ghetto was an area of about 1 mile in Japanese-occupied Shanghai. After the Japanese occupied all of Shanghai in 1941, they forced about 23,000 of the city's Jewish refugees to be restricted or relocated to the Shanghai Ghetto from 1941 to 1945. By August of 1941, the Japanese government closed Shanghai to Jewish immigration. Slide 24, Frank Foley. Slide 25, Rudolf Karol. Rudolf Karol was born in Pilsen, Czechoslovakia. Although he originally studied law at Charles University in Prague, he pursued a degree in composition at the Prague Conservatory, where he studied with Anton Dvorak in 1903 as his last student. In 1923, he became a professor at the Prague Conservatory. 3 years later, he was awarded the Czechoslovakian State Prize for his Capriccio for violin. After the Munich Pact went into effect, in which parts of northwestern Bohemia and northern Moravia in Germany were ceded to appease Hitler, Karol became active in the leftist resistance movement. He was a member of the anti-Nazi group Kosirk and actively provided support for the families of those who were imprisoned or had been executed. He continued working for the resistance and composing until his arrest in March of 1943 and subsequent imprisonment in Prague's Pankrak prison. The poor conditions in the prison and brutal interrogations took their toll on his health. In spite of these conditions, Karol continued composing, using medicinal charcoal to write on sheets of toilet paper. Thanks to the sympathetic prison warden, František Müller, several works survive from this period which he smuggled out. Müller's activities led in turn to his arrest. A collection of those works were later published as Works from Prison, Opus 42. Other works included the opera Three Hairs of an Old Wise Man and a chamber work entitled Nonette. On February 6, 1945, Karol was moved to Theresienstadt, the model camp for Jewish and political prisoners, including many artists, composers, and intellectuals. Karol's works during this time include March of the Prisoners, otherwise known as the Terezin March, Terezin Waltz, and the song Terezin with lyrics by fellow prisoner Stanislav Medik. Rudolf Karol's health was already weakened before he arrived in Theresienstadt, but it worsened over time until he fell ill with pneumonia and dysentery. He was held in a small cell with other sick prisoners. In March of 1945, he and the other cellmates were ordered outside in freezing temperatures while the cells were disinfected. Karol and 8 other prisoners died the following day and were buried in an unmarked grave in the Theresienstadt cemetery. Musical selection, Rudolf Karol, Sonata for Violin and Piano. Slide 26, Aristide de Sousa Mendes. Aristide de Sousa Mendes was the Portuguese consul general in Bordeaux with jurisdiction over the southwest region of France. In November of 1939, the Portuguese dictatorship of Antonio de Oliveira Salazar sent out Circular 14 to all Portuguese consuls throughout Europe, restricting Jewish refugees and other categories of refugees from settling in Portugal, which was a neutral country. Sousa Mendes disobeyed the dictates of Circular 14 immediately, indiscriminately issuing visas and passports to thousands of refugees fleeing Nazi-occupied France. Mendes never regretted his decision. To his lawyer, he wrote, "In truth, I disobeyed, but my disobedience does not dishonor me. I did not respect orders that to me represented the persecution of true castaways who sought with all their strength to be saved from Hitler's wrath. Above the order, for me, there was God's law, and that's the one I have always sought to adhere to without hesitation. The true value of the Christian religion is to love one's neighbor." Among those notable individuals who were issued visas by Mendes were painter Salvador Dali, whose Russian wife Gala was threatened by the Circular 14, actor Robert Montgomery, Maurice de Rothschild, financier and senator of France, Otto von Habsburg, the entire Belgian cabinet, and Hans and Margaret Ray, authors and illustrators of the Curious George series. Slide 27, Archbishop Damaskinos Papandreou. Slide 28, Alexander Lados. Slide 29, Gideon Klein. Gideon Klein was born in Prerov, Moravia, of Jewish heritage. A musically precocious child, he began piano studies with the head of the local conservatory at the age of 6. In the fall of 1939, he enrolled at Prague Conservatory, simultaneously taking courses in philosophy and musicology at Charles University. When the Nazis occupied Czechoslovakia in March of 1939, all institutions of higher learning were closed. thus precluding further collegiate studies for Klein. In 1940, he was offered a scholarship to study at the Royal Academy of Music in London, but by that time, Nazi emigration laws prevented him from leaving the country. Jewish musicians could no longer perform in public, so Klein concertized using the name Karel Wronek until even this ruse became too dangerous. On December 1st, 1941, Gideon Klein, along with thousands of other Prague Jews, was deported to Theresienstadt. Klein became active in the camp's cultural life, presenting solo and chamber music programs with his Prague colleagues in repeat performances, up to 11 times, devoting himself to the teaching of the camp's orphans and assisting in the preparation of and accompanying performances of Smetana's The Barded Bride, the Verdi Requiem, and other works. Klein's compositional output before and during his internment and his virtuosity as a pianist were impressive. One of Victor Ullmann's reviews of his second recital revealed his admiration for his younger colleagues' talent. Gideon Klein is, without doubt, a very remarkable talent. His is the cool, matter-of-fact style of the new youth. One has to marvel at his strangely early stylistic maturity. Gideon Klein's older sister, Aliska Klenova, had already been deported to Auschwitz when Klein and fellow composer Hans Krasse made a plan to save the music they had written in Theresienstadt. They entrusted their manuscripts to Irma Semska, Klein's last girlfriend, instructing her to give them to Aliska should she survive and the war and they meet again. 9 days after completing his string trio, which was his final composition, Klein was sent to Auschwitz on October 1st, 1944, and then to Fürstengrube, a coal mining labor camp for men near Katowice in Poland. He died less than 2 months after his 25th birthday. It is unknown if he was killed at the camp by the Nazis as the Red Army approached, or if he died on a forced march with other Jews as the SS was fleeing the Soviet armies. Irma met Aliska in Prague after the war and gave the manuscripts to her. Aliska, without enough money to buy a handkerchief, arranged the first concert of her brother's music on June 6, 1946, in the Rudolfineum in Prague. Conductor Karel Anserl wrote the following remarks about Gideon Klein. Where there was a valuable cultural performance, there for sure Gideon Klein was the initiator. Towards the end, before the final transports to Auschwitz, Gideon started to conduct. He had all the gifts, including an accurate ear for this art. It is difficult to say how and to what dimensions Gideon Klein would have grown under normal circumstances. One can say with certainty that he could have been among the best, achieving the utmost perfection in the pianist in art, in composing, and conducting. Musical selection, Gideon Klein, Preludium for solo viola. Slide 30, Oskar Schindler. German industrialist Oskar Schindler is credited with saving the lives of 1,200 Jews during the Holocaust by employing them in his enamelware and ammunitions factories in Poland. With a combination of diplomacy and bribery, Schindler and his wife, Emily, were able to not only save lives, but also improve the working and living conditions of the workers. By the end of World War II, Schindler has spent his entire fortune on bribes and black market items to sustain his workers. Oskar Schindler was buried in Jerusalem on Mount Zion, the only former member of the Nazi Party to be so honored. Slide 31, Raoul Wallenberg. Raoul Wallenberg was a Swedish diplomat who saved thousands of Jewish lives in German-occupied Hungary during the Holocaust. In 1944, reports of the atrocities at the Auschwitz-Birkenau extermination camp and the ghettoization and deportation of 435,000 Hungarian Jews reached the United States President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. The Roosevelt administration turned to the newly created War Refugee Board in search of a solution to the genocide. Wallenberg was appointed to lead a mission to travel to Budapest and organize a rescue program for the nation's Jews. In collaboration with Karl Lutz, Wallenberg issued protective passes which identified the bearers as Swedish subjects and thus prevented deportation. He also helped establish the safe houses around Budapest. Raoul Wallenberg disappeared January 17, 1945, and was deported to Moscow. He most likely died in 1947, possibly executed by the Soviets for espionage in prison. In 2012, Russian Lieutenant General Kristoforov, head of the registration brand of the Russian Federal Security Service, declared that the Wallenberg case is still open. Slide 32, Karl Amadeus Hartmann. Karl Amadeus Hartmann was a socialist German composer who took a strong anti-fascist position during World War II. Hartmann was born in Munich, the youngest of 4 brothers, of whom the elder 3 became professional artists. Hartmann enrolled in the Munich Academy and studied with Joseph Haas, who had been a pupil of Max Reger. He also studied with Anton Webern and Hermann Scherchen, a conductor who was a proponent of the Schoenberg School. When the Nazis initiated war across Europe, Hartmann withdrew from the German musical scene and refused to have his works performed. The Nazi regime, in response to his refusal to comply with its political ideology, labeled his music atonal and degenerate. Hartmann's works were in fact infused with his political views and sympathies for victims of the Nazi regime. An early symphonic poem entitled Miserere was dedicated to his friends who sleep for all eternity. We do not forget you. His piano sonata depicted the shuffling feet of 20,000 camp prisoners from Dachau, whom Hartmann watched being marched away from the approaching Allies. His 2-movement Symphonia Tragica lamented the war, which he proclaimed the greatest of all crimes of tyranny. Many of Hartmann's other works were written as political statements. Concerto Funebre, a concerto for violin and string orchestra, was originally entitled Music of Mourning to protest Hitler's occupation of Prague. Czech chorales are inserted in the movements of the concerto, and a quotation from the German song Immortal Victims appears in the final movement. Symphony No. 1, Essay for a Requiem, was later known as Our Life Symphonic Fragment, which was a commentary on the miserable environment for artists under the Nazi regime. After the fall of the Third Reich, when the horrors perpetuated by the Nazis were brought to light for the world to see, Hartmann changed the title to Symphonic Fragment, attempt at a requiem to honor the millions killed during the Holocaust. Karl Amadeus Hartmann was one of the few composers who was not associated with the Nazi regime in post-war Germany. As such, the Allied administration felt he could be placed in a position of influence in the cultural arena. In 1945, he was appointed director of the Bavarian State Opera. In this position, he became a key figure in rebuilding the musical life of West Germany. He launched the Musica Viva concert series in 1945 to reintroduce the German public to 20th century music previously banned by the Nazis. Hartmann thus provided a platform for the music of young composers such as Hans Werner Henze, Luigi Nono, Karl Orff, Luigi Dalla Piccola, Ioannis Xenakis, Oliver Messiaen, and Luciano Berio. Musical selection: Chorale, Langsamer March from Concerto Funèbre. Slide 33, quote from the Talmud. The human paradigm resonates throughout human history. Humanity is simultaneously capable of both the greatest good and the greatest evil. Never has this been more apparent than during the Holocaust, which is arguably one of the darkest periods in human history that continues to evade explanation. According to Dr. Mordecai Paldil, director of Yad Vashem's Department of the Righteous, goodness leaves us gasping, for we refuse to recognize it as a natural human attribute. Evil is, by contrast, less painfully assimilated. We have come to terms with evil. Television, movies, and the printed word have made evil, aggression, and egotism household terms and unconsciously acceptable to the extent of making us immune to displays of evil. There is a danger that the evil of the Holocaust will be absorbed in a similar manner. The Second World War and the Holocaust were two of the most influential events in human history, tragic events that would awaken human consciousness toward the idea that the human species has demonstrated an enormous capacity for both destruction and self-destruction. May we never forget nor ever utilize that capacity again.